Babies are very challenging. So one thing I'd say about working with babies is that when they're young, they have very little time that they can be attentive. And just in general, we had assessments where the baby fell asleep. So, okay, are we going to wait? Are we going to come back? What are we going to do? So it's definitely a challenge.
From the heart of The Ohio State University on the Oval, this is Voices of Excellence from the College of Arts and Sciences with your host, David Staley. Voices focuses on the innovative work of arts and sciences faculty and staff, with departments as wide-ranging as art, astronomy, chemistry and biochemistry, physics, emergent materials, and mathematics and languages, among many others. The college always has something exciting happening. Join us to find out what's new now.
I'm joined today by Sarah Schoppe-Sullivan, Professor of Developmental Psychology at The Ohio State University College of the Arts and Sciences. She is a nationally and internationally recognized expert on co-parenting, father-child relationships, and the transition to parenthood. She is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science, and the National Council on Family Relations. She also serves as the president of the board of the Council on Contemporary Families. Dr. Schoppe-Sullivan, welcome to Voices.
Thank you.
So you direct here at Ohio State the Children and Parents Lab, and I'd like to start there. Tell us about the work of this lab.
Yeah, so the Children and Parents Lab is in the Department of Psychology at Ohio State, and it's a collection of graduate and undergraduate students under my direction, and we study the roles of families in the development of young children. In particular, we focus on social and emotional development of children, typically children 0 to 5. That's the focus.
One of the initiatives of your lab is the New Parents Project, and I want to do a deep dive here. Tell us about this project.
Sure. The New Parents Project was launched in 2008, so it's been going on for quite a while now. At that time, with funding from NSF and NIH, we recruited nearly 200 couples in Central Ohio who are expecting their first child. These were expectant parents. These were all couples headed by mothers and fathers, so different sex couples. And we followed them across their transition to becoming parents. So we interviewed, surveyed, and actually observed the couples interacting together during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. And then we followed up initially when their children were 3 months, 6 months, and 9 months old. So we repeated our interviews and surveys, and we did observations then with the babies included.
And what did you learn, or what have you learned from this project?
We've learned a lot of things. The original goals of the study were really to understand the development of father-infant relationships over the transition, because there's been less research in developmental psychology and other fields on the development of father-child relationships compared to the development of mother-child relationships. But we were also interested in how relationships that fathers have with children's mothers may influence the relationships that they are able to develop with their children, how involved they are, how close they are with their children. So we did more of a family study in that way. So we studied mothers in addition to fathers and their developing relationships with their children.
How do you determine closeness, I guess, for lack of a better word?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of ways. Really, what we focused on in the initial part of the New Parents Project was the development of high-quality parenting. So one aspect of high-quality parenting is sensitive parenting. Parent sensitivity is when parents are able to respond promptly and appropriately to their infant's signals and needs. And so that's one indicator we use. We actually video recorded fathers interacting with their babies and also mothers interacting separately with their babies. And then I trained students to use a system for rating the quality of the father's parenting behavior, including his sensitivity. We were then able to look at what influenced why some fathers were more sensitive with their infants than other fathers.
What are the determinants?
Well, one of the factors we focused on in the New Parents Project is something called maternal gatekeeping. Maternal gatekeeping is mothers' efforts to either encourage fathers to be very involved in parenting infants and young children, to support their involvement, or to discourage them by criticizing them or monopolizing time with the infant and so forth. So we found in the New Parents Project, with respect to maternal gatekeeping, we found that that is one factor that can affect how involved fathers are in terms of time and frequency of, doing things like reading with the baby or playing with the baby or changing the baby's diapers, things like that. But also actually that parenting quality, the father's quality of his parenting can be undermined, for example, if his wife or the child's mother is critical of his efforts to engage with or interact with the infant.
Presumably, father-infant relationships are different from mother-infant relationships. In what ways?
That's a great question. And actually, I would say the jury's still out a little bit on the extent to which mothers and fathers are more similar than different, or they're more different than similar. Folks in my field have different perspectives on this issue. We do know that there are some average differences, but there is a lot of overlap as well. One difference that emerges later in infancy, toddlerhood, and the preschool years is that fathers tend to engage in more rough and tumble play with children than mothers do. So they tend to do more things like, play wrestling, play chasing games. So some of the listeners might remember, doing these things with their kids or having their parents or maybe in particular fathers do those things with them. So there are some differences that can be identified.
I know one of the things that you examine is how new mothers and fathers divide childcare. What does that look like?
Well, that's an interest of mine in part because many couples, especially couples in which both partners have careers and are working full-time for pay outside the home in addition to parenting children, many of those couples really desire to share childcare equally or relatively equally after having kids. But it really regularly fails to happen that way. And this is for a number of reasons. It's not just stuff internal to the family, of course. There are policies regarding, parental leave and things like that that aren't necessarily equivalent, for men and for women and so forth that can be influential as well. But I was really interested in that phenomenon. Like, why would couples who, want to share parenting more equally, perhaps than their parents or grandparents did, why do they fail to do it? And so our research with the New Parents Project, these were all couples who were working full time prior to the birth of the child and were planning to go back to work full time within 3 months of the child's birth. Both partners are planning to do this. Most all of them actually did do that, but there still were persistent inequalities in terms of childcare, with mothers doing substantially more childcare than fathers. So we demonstrated that too in our data. Another interesting thing is that in order to measure the division of childcare, we not only used surveys. Typically, this is traditional. You ask people, how many hours per week do you spend on X activity? And you have a list of childcare activities. People are very bad at being accurate in that. All new parents think they're doing tons and they're super overwhelmed, which is understandable because it's a very difficult, challenging, joyful yet challenging period of life. But we found a striking disconnect between what people say on surveys and what we are able to glean from more precise measures and perhaps more objective measures like a time diary. So we asked the partners, mothers and fathers in the study, to keep detailed 24-hour diaries of everything they did, not just parenting, but working and sleeping and all these things. And then we were able to gauge their involvement in terms of minutes spent in various activities and then compare that to their survey responses. And those don't always align.
So what explains that misalignment?
Some of it, I think, is just difficulty being accurate when you're asked to make a global judgment about how many hours per week you spend doing anything. It's hard because you haven't really been paying attention. Also, there's obviously variations from day to day and week to week that can play a role as well. But in our research, people's ideas about gender roles and parent roles also play a role. So one example of a finding is that mothers actually in our study felt like they spent fewer hours in paid work after their child was born. That's what they said they did on a survey. But when we actually looked at the objective data, they hadn't actually decreased the amount of time that they were spending in paid work. So what that could reflect is that they feel like, they're mothers, so they're expected to devote themselves, to their infants. And they may perceive that the child is taking up more of their time, but that might not necessarily be true, if that makes any sense. So I think that parents' expectations have a lot to do with it.
Earlier, you said that one of the factors here was parental leave. Say a little more about that. What's the impact of parental leave policies?
Sure. In the U.S., we don't have a national paid parental leave policy. What we have is the Family and Medical Leave Act, which was passed in the 90s, and guarantees, I think it's 12 weeks of unpaid leave for caring for a family member or the birth or adoption of a child. But there are also additional restrictions. You have to work for a company with a certain number of employees, and it's very hard for people to take unpaid leave. That is just very, very difficult. So there are states, for example, Wisconsin, New York State, California, that have implemented paid leave policies for new parents. So there are state level policies that exist. But Ohio does not have such a policy. So the Families and the New Parents Project took varying amounts of leave after the births of their children, largely depending on whether they could take unpaid leave, whether they had paid leave through their employer, those sorts of factors. And so what we're able to do in the study is track the amount of leave parents took, whether it was paid or unpaid, and we were able to look at how the amount of leave might have shaped developing family dynamics. So one finding, for example, is I was talking earlier about maternal gatekeeping, so mothers' encouragement or discouragement of fathers' involvement in parenting. And I should say that the idea behind that is not to put all the blame on mothers for whether or not fathers are involved or not with their kids, but to recognize that, in many societies around the world, mothers are still the primary caregivers of infants and young children. And so the argument is that therefore they may have somewhat more control over that domain of family life. And so what we found is that when fathers took longer leave from their paid work after the birth of their first child, that mothers actually did less gatekeeping and their attitudes were more favorable towards the father's parenting and his involvement with the children. And so that kind of flips the script a bit, saying, fathers bear some responsibility here too. So fathers who are signaling to mothers that they are really invested in being more equal parents, then mothers seem to back off a bit and allow them space to, develop their relationships with their kids on their own terms.
What about romantic relationships between parents, especially as they transition into parenthood? I think this is an area that you've examined as well.
Yes. So most of the couples I've studied have, and all the couples in the New Parents Project at the outset were married or cohabiting and romantically involved with one another. And in our study, and in actually there's quite a literature out there that suggests that the transition to parenthood is a very challenging period for a couple's romantic relationships. I mean, you can imagine endless reasons why. You don't get enough sleep. There's not time for intimacy. The children take so much time and energy. There's often parents, and especially fathers, may actually lean into paid work because they feel like that's an important part of their role to help provide resources for the family. So our study and many, many others suggest that couples' perceptions of the quality of their romantic relationships decline over that transition. But the interesting part is that's not true of everybody. So there are some couples who maintain high quality, satisfying romantic relationships and others who don't. So that's where that literature is now in terms of trying to understand, who are these couples and why are some people able to maintain high relationship quality even through a very challenging period for their relationship.
Earlier, you had said that father-infant relationships are less examined, less studied in the literature. What explains that?
I think father-infant relationships have received less attention in psychology, really because of traditional views about parent and gender roles. Before mothers were really, flocking to the paid workforce in the 1960s and 1970s in the U.S. Of course, there have always been mothers that were working. But before that big change and associated social change, the view of mothers and fathers' roles was that they were very distinct. And so as social change happened in the U.S. and other places in the 60s and 70s, then there became more interest in fathers participating in parenting and childcare. And so that's when it really started. And prior to that, especially in psychology too, they're, influenced by Freud, certainly. Lots of focus on mothers.
Still.
Yeah. Lots of focus on mothers. I mean, things are changing. There has been, over the course of my career, definitely an increase in research on fathers. Another reason there's less research on fathers, though, is they're harder to recruit and retain in research studies. They are maybe working long hours, especially if you're talking about fathers that have lower levels of education or economic resources. They might be working multiple jobs. It can be hard to engage them and to keep them in your studies. So that's one thing that I'm proud of that we've been able to do successfully in the New Parents Project and in other studies is study fathers right alongside mothers and continue to engage them in the research over the long haul.
Well, I'm interested in another study that you conducted. My understanding is that this study has ended, but this is the Parents and Preschoolers study. Tell us a little bit about this research.
So that was the first study I did as a new assistant professor at Ohio State in terms of collecting data here. And it was a small study, but it was exciting because I got a federal grant to complete the study, which was, as an assistant professor, was a really amazing thing. It was a small grant from NIH, but it was really helpful. The study recruited about 100 mother-father couples with preschool-age children in Columbus and the surrounding area. And we only followed them in that study for 1 year. But the goal of that study was to examine how fathers' involvement in parenting was related to the quality of the co-parenting relationship between parents. In our research, the co-parenting relationship is the relationship that parents share with each other with respect to parenting children. And originally, the co-parenting concept came out of the literature on divorce, where it was recognized that if a mother and father are no longer married, there has to be some kind of plan, right? Or some kind of arrangement, custody arrangement and things like that. And when there was some degree of shared custody, we would talk about that as co-parenting. Since that time, though, which was in the 70s and 80s, there's been an increasing recognition that even couples who are married or romantically involved and they have kids, that they are still engaged in a co-parenting relationship. They are still relating to each other in their roles as parents in a way that they didn't before they became parents. So we took the concept of co-parenting and expanded it really to reflect dynamics that happen in married parent families or any families in which the parents are also romantically involved. It doesn't have to be something that only applies post-divorce.
So you've, in a sense, redefined co-parenting. Is this you?
I was part of it. It was not me. I was not the first person to do it. But in the 1990s, there were a few researchers out there, when I was in graduate school, who had started talking about co-parenting in this way. And I, got in on the ground level. I thought it was really, really interesting. And so I definitely helped to build that literature.
Well, speaking of that literature, you have a journal article. It's in press right now. Co-parenting from different perspectives and associations with child and family functioning. Tell us a bit about this research.
Sure. So this research uses data from the New Parents Project, and my two co-authors are one former Ohio State grad student who's now at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and another current Ohio State graduate student. And what we did is we took advantage of the fact that in the New Parents Project, we have really rich data on co-parenting relationships. So we not only have mothers' reports using surveys about the quality of their co-parenting relationship with the father and fathers' reports about the quality of that relationship with the mother, but we also have observations of co-parenting from video recorded mother-father infant interactions. And so I train students to rate the quality of those interactions, whether they're more supportive or whether they're less supportive. And so we combined that information using a quantitative analysis method called latent profile analysis. So what latent profile analysis does is try to uncover groups in the data. And it's a really interesting way to look at differences or discrepancies between different sources of information about family relationships, in this case, co-parenting. So you might think that mothers and fathers are always on the same page if you ask them independently about the quality of their relationship. Well, that's not true. And then if you add in more objective observers' reports, those are even less likely to be extremely coherent with what parents say themselves. And so what we did is we subjected all that data to this analysis approach and uncovered different groups. And the most interesting finding was that there was a group of families in which both parents said that co-parenting was going pretty well, but the observers' ratings were lower. And that group was actually the group that had, when we looked at outcomes a bit later, that had children that were struggling a bit in terms of their social emotional development. And so I think that's probably the most notable finding there. So observers must be seeing something that parents aren't. We're going to follow up to try to figure out exactly what explains maybe how those different configurations of, or different sources of information about co-parenting relationships go together or fail to do so.
So a few times now you've talked about using video with these families. So are we talking about like one of your assistants standing there with a camera? Are we talking about cameras that are placed around their dwelling? In what way are your subjects being videoed?
That's a great question. So most typically what we do, and this could be done in the lab where we do have wall-mounted cameras. We have a setup, looks like a living room, so we could invite parents in, and they obviously have to give permission to be video recorded, all that stuff.
But this is not in their home necessarily.
We've done it both places.
Okay.
So we can do video recordings in the lab, but in the New Parents Project, we did a lot of our video recordings in parents' homes. We would bring 2 tripod-mounted cameras and set them up. The research assistants, if it's possible to leave the room, they will do that. So yes, there are cameras on, but we try to be as unobtrusive as possible and let people just feel comfortable enough, hopefully, to behave as they normally would. One interesting development in terms of methods since the COVID-19 pandemic is that now we can do family observations on Zoom. And actually, we're doing some of those right now where you give families instructions to record themselves, basically. And then it's more convenient for families and actually for the researchers as well. So they can record themselves doing some kind of interactive task that, we instruct them to do. And so that is a promising way, I think, of continuing to gather observational data and hopefully of diversifying perhaps the participants in studies that use that as a technique.
I hope you don't find this an impertinent question.
I'm sure I won't.
Do you think that there is a difference in outcomes when you have, an observer there with a camera on a tripod versus cameras, wall-mounted cameras in a home versus cameras in a lab setting versus doing this over Zoom?
The Zoom observations are so new. I don't know that we know that yet. I do think that being in a laboratory setting adds another layer of strangeness to the whole endeavor that may affect parents' behavior. I think that for that reason, I tend to prefer doing the home observations because at least people are in their own environment. Now, in the New Parents Project, another reason we did home observations was because these are folks who are giving us their time and they have small babies. And we did not want to make them try to come to campus with their babies. And I think that helped us get a great deal of retention of the participants because we really tried to think about what would be easiest for them.
As a researcher, for you, is it challenging to work with babies?
Oh, sure. Yes. Babies are very challenging. So one thing I'd say about working with babies, and especially doing observations or doing any kind of interacting with them, any kind of assessment of infants or things like that, is that when they're young, they have very little time that they can be attentive or, honestly not fussing, crying, eating, sleeping, needing a diaper change. So any kind of task or observation has to be necessarily brief. So, for example, in the New Parents Project, when the infants were 3 months old, I said we observed them interacting with their mom and their dad and both their mom and dad together. Those interactions were 5 minutes each. They couldn't really be longer. And as children get older, you can, of course, observe them or engage them for a longer period. So that is one challenge. And just in general, we had assessments where the baby fell asleep. So, okay, are we going to wait? Are we going to come back? What are we going to do? So it's definitely a challenge.
Why are you a developmental psychologist? Did you know when you were 5 years old you were going to be a developmental psychologist?
No, I definitely didn't know I wanted to be a developmental psychologist. I wanted to be an archaeologist for many, many years. But when I was a senior in high school, I had the opportunity to take an advanced placement psychology class. And the high school teacher who taught my class actually had a PhD in psychology. And so it was a really great experience. And that's what sparked my interest in psychology. I think my interest in families and parenting and child development came from a tendency I think I've always had to just really be an observer of behavior. And I guess I feel like children are fascinating to observe and try to figure out how they think about the world, how they view the world. And so I became interested in children, I think, for that reason as well.
Has your understanding of the idea of the family changed, evolved over the course of your career?
That's a really tough question. I think that my take on the family currently is that it is the quality of relationships in families that is more important than exactly what parents do or don't do. I think that as a developmental psychologist, I have come to think that, parenting trends come and go. But what the research consistently shows is that those close relationships where children feel secure in their relationship with their mother, father, whoever their parents are, because clearly parent figures can be more than just mothers and fathers, and that's an important point as well. But if they feel secure in that relationship, they feel loved, they will be able to actually explore the environment to learn the things they need to do because they know that they always can go to their parent if they're scared or hurt. It actually gives them the confidence to be able to embrace all the opportunities that their childhood and their life offers.
Has any of your research informed interventions, programs, policies, changes that support families?
It's hard to identify specific impacts, but for example, my research on co-parenting and the transition to parenthood has informed the development of programs for expectant and new parents, and especially for expectant and new fathers to try to help support them across that transition. In my role as president of the board of the Council on Contemporary Families, we actively work to get the latest research findings out to the general public and to policymakers about American families. So I spend a lot of my time helping researchers to translate their work for broader audiences so it can have that kind of impact. So yes, that is the main way that I take my own work and that of others who study families in the U.S. and we get it out there in the hopes that it will influence policies that can be more supportive of families and children across the country.
Tell us what's next for your research.
Well, I think the most exciting thing going on right now is one of my graduate students is leading a follow-up of the families in the New Parents Project. The children are now almost 15 years old, and she is collecting survey data from the adolescents and their parents. And we're also collecting Zoom observations of discussions between the mothers, fathers, and adolescent children. So we'll be able to look at how the kids are doing now, how their parents are doing now. The kids are old enough now that we can get their perspectives on their parents' co-parenting relationship, which is something novel as well. So that'll I'm sure introduce another wrinkle that, another perspective that doesn't necessarily align with what mom thinks, dad thinks, or the observers think. But it's pretty exciting that we've been able to continue to conduct this unique study of Central Ohio families for so many years.
It's challenging to do these sorts of longitudinal studies. I've got to think that's a real challenge.
It is really challenging, but I'm so glad that I've done it and that I continue to have students and collaborators who are interested in, sharing the weight to try to, keep such an interesting study going.
Sarah Schoppe-Sullivan, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Voices of Excellence is produced and recorded at The Ohio State University College of Arts and Sciences Marketing and Communications Studio. More information about the podcast and our guests can be found at go.osu.edu/voices. Voices of Excellence is produced by Doug Dangler. I'm Jen Farmer.